By the 1970s, war had stalked the Southeast Asian country of Vietnam for a generation. Since the Second World War, global superpowers had been locked in a battle for dominance in the region and had split the country into two.
In the spring of 1975, it had become clear that the Republic of Vietnam, better known as South Vietnam, was losing the fight against the communist forces of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which was commonly referred to as North Vietnam. By then, thousands of people had died or been injured in the titanic struggle for control of Vietnam. Although the fall of Saigon, as it was known, brought a halt to the international portion of the war, for many who were in the country, it also ushered in a difficult new era.
As northern Vietnam troops descended upon Saigon, today known as Ho Chi Minh City, thousands of Vietnamese, as well as foreigners still in the city, tried to get out before it was too late. Among them was Louis Hossel, an American missionary who had arrived the summer before to preach the gospel. This is Saints Volume 4, the podcast. I'm Tessie Tsai.
And I'm James Perry. Saints and the Vietnam War. Vietnam had been the center of conflict for most of the 20th century and had defeated France's effort to retake the formerly colonized country. That war, however, split Vietnam in two, and the northern half was supported by Soviet Russia and Communist China. The United States, concerned at the potential of a spread in communist ideology, supported the southern half's resistance of the communist pressure from the north. In 1964, the US involved itself directly into the bloody conflict, and with the troops came the church.
Thousands of Latter-day Saint servicemen were stationed in Vietnam during the war. Church leaders organized them into groups and districts, with some American servicemen called as part-time missionaries. A small chapel was constructed on one of the bases for members to worship in. Vietnamese civilians and members of the armed forces came into contact with these Latter-day Saints, and some were converted to the church. This small band of saints proved faithful and assisted with translation, missionary work, and running the church in Vietnam.
The American servicemen were important to the growth of the church in Vietnam, but in 1973, full-time missionaries were assigned to labor in the capital of Saigon. Among them was Louis. He had graduated from high school in 1973 and spent a year at Brigham Young University while preparing his mission papers. During the Vietnam War, the US had imposed a limit on how many young men could serve missions, as the military draft was in full force. The draft had ended in January 1973, but Louis could not have anticipated that he would be sent to Vietnam, not in an army uniform, but with a missionary name tag.
Just before the winter semester ended, my mother got a strange phone call from a Mr. Bowman. And he called her and said, "I understand your son's been called to Vietnam, and we're having a group of the missionaries that just got back from Vietnam over at our home. My son's there serving," and so forth and so on. And my mother stopped for a moment and said, "Wait a second, my son doesn't have his mission call yet. He's still waiting for it." And so we were completely flummoxed by what was going on. We got the letter on Saturday, but it said nothing about Vietnam. It said Hong Kong mission and talked about going to the MTC and Hawaii and various other sorts of things. So we were really in the dark and only going on Brother Bowman's word that someone in the missionary office had told him that Louis Hossel and 2 or 3 other young men had mission calls to go to the Vietnam zone in the Hong Kong mission. I was completely shocked and stunned by the call, yet willing to go, because certainly I had a draft number and many people just slightly older than I had been drafted or served there. So it seemed very ironic that I would be going to preach the gospel in a country where so many of the other young men my age and a little older had fought a war as soldiers.
Louis arrived in the summer of 1974. It was a dynamic time when missionary work was just developing roots in the country, much as the church itself. A native of Utah and used to the state's dry desert climate, Louis was stunned by the sweltering heat of Saigon, as well as the sheer size and density of the city. The contrast between the haves and have-nots was stark, too. From streets lined with elegant mansions dripping with French architectural details, to cardboard huts cobbled together next to railroad tracks. Another stark contrast was the inescapable signs of war and the warmth of the people he met.
You would see lots and lots of barbed wire. The chapel was not too far from the central police station, which was heavily guarded and had barbed wire along every possible ledge or crevice that could be possibly used for any sort of entry. And that was true in most all areas of the city, that there was a lot of concern about security, as evidenced by these large gates and barred windows and barbed wire. On the other hand, as we met people, they were warm and friendly and curious, of course. We were so different to them, and we walked down a street to go to visit a contact or a member or something of that sort. And all the little kids in the neighborhood, as soon as they saw us, they would come clamoring after us.
Lewis worked closely with members of the branch. It may have been US soldiers and expats who had initially established branches, but the church was already flourishing and Vietnamese membership was growing. All of them were invaluable to the new missionaries, who didn't have the training most missionaries around the world had before setting off for Saigon. The first missionaries to Vietnam in the 1970s had come from the Hong Kong mission with enthusiasm and set about learning Vietnamese. Lewis arrived soon after and was able to learn from his fellow missionaries and others. There was a lot of learning on the job.
We didn't have an MTC experience like any others. We had companions who knew the language, and then they hired an instructor to come in a few hours a day for the 5 days a week to teach us some of the basics of the language that we could then go out in the afternoons or evenings with our companions and try to practice and learn how it really worked. And of course, we discovered that we could understand our companions much better than we could understand our teacher or some of the native speakers. But eventually that method was very motivating, because from that first day you were in actual teaching situations and able to begin to try to listen and to share the 1 or 2 sentences of language that you were acquiring bit by bit to communicate with the people that you were meeting. The branch that I came to in the middle of 1974 consisted of, an average attendance probably in about 130 to 150. We had a branch conference shortly after I arrived, at which President Wheat came to reorganize the branch presidency and create an entirely Vietnamese branch presidency. And for that branch conference, I think there were 150 people present, the vast majority of which were Vietnamese people. We had a few expat families. There were a few other families, military associated or contractors, but the majority of the people were attending were Vietnamese saints who had been either taught by district missionaries amongst the military while they were there associated with them, or who'd been introduced by friends to the early missionaries who'd been there just over a year when I arrived.
Nguyen Van Tay had already been serving as branch president, but with this change, his American counselor was released and a Vietnamese brother called instead. Tay and his wife, Lê My Lien, were both young and recent converts to the church and had 2 small children to raise. You can read more about the Nguyen's in Saints, Volume 4. But to Lewis, it was obvious that their faith was as strong as their devotion to helping their neighbors.
It was evident to me that he was so fully committed to the gospel and so convinced of its value that he was eager to do anything and everything to build the kingdom. And he loved the saints. He was also young. Now, his wife, that was also a convert, and he had helped to introduce her to the gospel by having her type portions of the scriptures as they were being translated. And then they married and began to have children, and the oldest was still very young.
Members weren't only vital for language learning, but for introducing missionaries to people to teach. The branch was made up of many families, and the church's family-centered values and programs were a significant draw for many Vietnamese people. Members were crucial to missionary work by inviting their friends and neighbors over to listen to the missionaries.
The members were very anxious to introduce their friends to the missionaries, their family members, their extended family member. President Tay was like this. He had cousins and friends of his wife's family and sisters and so forth that he was eager to have taught the gospel. And one of these was one of the first baptisms after the missionaries arrived. Sister Nha was baptized in July, and they only arrived in April. And so to have somebody ready for baptism that quickly was quite remarkable. And then there were various people who'd had contact with the church in other areas who could see its virtues and would tell their friends. And so President Tay invited some of his army friends to learn about the gospel. And then sometimes there would be people who would just see the sign on the street and would be struck by it and come to the door, literally come to the door of the church and knock.
The Vietnamese saints worked hard to share the gospel that they had been introduced to. The message of the gospel resonated with the people, and many people went to great lengths to accept, live, and share it with others. It was a busy, exciting time, filled with activities, baptisms, and growth.
And the members were a key part in this. And as there began to be more members participating or able to participate in missionary work, for example, we had some of the newer members of the church who were called as branch missionaries. And they could go places and listen and talk to people that we couldn't. And they were eager to help us to make connections and to collaborate with us.
As exciting as the missionary work was, it was impossible to forget about the war, and especially the involvement of Lewis's government within it. While most Vietnamese were friendly to missionaries, some of them couldn't forget it either.
We were welcomed, we were appreciated, and there was never any sense of bitterness or anger until 1975, and after the subsequent offensive, the final offensive that led to the downfall of the South Vietnamese government. And there were large numbers of refugees coming into the city. And one particular contact that we had, and we went to visit, who had family who were coming from the central portion of Vietnam, said to us, "Your country is really responsible for this. You have set us up to fail."
The more Lewis got to know the people in the branch and the city, the more he realized the impact war was having. The barbed wire, the frequent sights of uniformed soldiers, and the distant sounds of gunfire were reminders of war, but the real and lasting effects were visible too.
In Vietnamese traditions, when someone in your family passes away, there are specified periods of mourning. And one element of that mourning is that you'll wear a little square of black cloth pinned to your shirt for a year after you've had a loved one pass away. And I would say that 50, 60 or more % of the people you would see had some sort of an indication that they had lost something in the fairly recent past. That makes you aware that it has very real effects.
Just months after Lewis arrived in Vietnam, the political situation began to noticeably deteriorate. Although he didn't have much access to the outside world and little to no knowledge of the way events were unfolding, there were signs emerging the spring of 1975, though Lewis and the other missionaries and members didn't necessarily know about them at the time. Communication with the mission president, Jerry Wheat, in Hong Kong broke down, and the availability of flights and other transportation away from Vietnam was diminishing quickly. On April 2nd, President Wheat tried to send a telegram to missionaries in Vietnam urging them to get visas to travel to Hong Kong. The telegram never arrived, and from the north, the front lines were advancing quickly towards Saigon.
When he finally realized that the North Vietnamese forces had crossed his 200-mile trigger zone of when he would need to remove the missionaries, and he went to make that decision and communicate that to us, he discovered that he couldn't communicate with us. He couldn't get a phone call into Saigon because all the phone lines were booked for the next 24 hours. He had difficulty getting airplane reservations for us to get out because Pan Am wasn't accepting reservations from outside the country. And so he was really feeling as though he was in a very difficult situation with some young men that he really dearly loved and wanted to help and protect and was responsible for. And as he said at one point, when I wasn't on the phone, I was on my knees pleading with the Lord to somehow get the message to them.
Finally, President Wheat was able to speak with a member of the church who worked at the consulate in Hong Kong. Through that contact, President Wheat was able to get word to Vietnam for the missionaries to get ready to leave, and soon. But for the members and the missionaries, the calls for the missionaries to pull out came as a surprise. From their vantage point, things weren't much worse than they had been in the previous months, and the note from President Wheat didn't give more context to the order.
We had a large number of people who were committed or preparing for baptism. We had, between the 4 companionships, about 90 investigators, of which probably 50 or 60 of them were committed to baptism in the coming 6 weeks. It was really a dramatic acceleration of the work that we were experiencing, so it made it very difficult to depart. When I went out that evening with my companion, we had to prioritize who we were going to visit. When we told them of our need to go and exhorted them to faithfulness and so forth, one of the wives just broke down in tears and had to leave the room. And her children were like, what's going on? And not completely understanding what this all meant. But the father said, I understand. And I know that there are hard times ahead. But we'll try to be faithful and trust the Lord. And of course, we will be praying. It was very emotionally rending for the members as well as for the missionaries. Now, President Wheat, when the missionaries arrived and he could sense that feeling, he said to them, I promise you in the name of the Lord that you'll be able to go back. But he didn't say when. And of course, some of us as missionaries hung on to those words and that hope because we loved those people that we had served and we wanted to be able to go back. And perhaps many of us would have willingly stayed had the circumstances and the direction been different. It was a very emotional and trying period for both the members and for the missionaries, and as well for the investigators who were coming to love the church and to appreciate its value for them.
The instructions from President Wheat primarily told the missionaries to pack up and leave. 7 missionaries were to fly out the next day, 2 more the following morning, and the last 2 on the day after that.
We were not, as missionaries, told what to bring and what to leave. Some of us thought, well, this is only just going to be temporary and we'll be back. And so we packed a number of things that we would need in Hong Kong, but we left a number of the things that we were optimistic, or that were either too bulky to bring or that we hoped that we would be back to. For example, Elder Anderson was beloved of the missionaries because he had an Oster blender. And with that Oster blender, he could make peanut butter. Of course, you know, missionaries almost live on peanut butter sometimes, and peanuts were very prevalent in Vietnam. So we had wonderful, freshly ground peanut butter because of his blender. But he chose to leave that blender. He didn't think he would need it in Hong Kong.
Getting ready to go, however, was more involved than simply deciding whether or not to pack a blender. The missionaries hadn't received President Wheat's previous order to get visas for Hong Kong, and the visa application process in Vietnam took several weeks, even under the best of circumstances. So for Louis, the series of events that allowed them to leave were a strong sign that heaven was lending a helping hand.
When news of this departure, less than 24 hours from when we got it, came, we knew that somebody had to get clearances. We had to get clearances to be able to do this. So Elder Bowman, who was the zone leader, took his companion and went to the office, and he looked at the lines in that office and he said, there's no way we can go through this line and get our clearances. And as he looked around, he saw an office door off to the side that was open. So he poked his head in there, and in his most polite Vietnamese, he explained their circumstance and asked the man who had a few stripes on his shoulder collar if he could help him. The man said, yes, I think I can help you. Do you have your passports? I can stamp them. And Elder Bowman's jaw was on the floor when this response came. Now, unfortunately, he didn't have the passports because those were being held at the embassy for safekeeping and somebody else had gone to get them. But he explained that, and the man said, well, you come back here at 8 o'clock in the morning and we'll take care of it. Now, that was just absolutely unheard of, that kind of bureaucratic hurdle and red tape could be swept away by a humble and prayerful request.
Members of the church outside of Vietnam did what they could to help Vietnamese members leave and resettle in the US if they wanted to. President Tay sent his family but stayed behind with the intent of following his wife and children once he had ensured all branch members were safe. That did not go according to plan, and the missionaries who had hoped their evacuation to Hong Kong would be a temporary one eventually returned home, disappointed. Sending letters to those who remained in Vietnam was considered too risky because of the strong anti-American sentiment that existed there after the war ended. But in a fulfillment of President Wheat's promise, Louis and his fellow missionaries have found a kind of returning in the decades since, some in course of service, and some in relation to a group he joined comprised of former members, servicemen, and missionaries to Vietnam.
Over the years since that time, I had a number of wonderful reconnections with members of the church. For example, when a Vietnamese branch was begun in Salt Lake City in about 1980, about 5 years later, My wife and I were able to serve in that branch and participate with others who had joined the church both in Vietnam and many who had joined subsequent to their immigration to the United States. And then this group got an invitation to revisit Vietnam in 1989. And so I went along with 3 other people to do some humanitarian work and to also try to reconnect with some of the members. And during the course of that visit, we were able to reconnect with one of the people that I had helped teach and taught. And we actually held a sacrament meeting. I had permission to hold a sacrament meeting with him. So that was a very tender opportunity to reconnect with someone I had taught and loved about 14 years after we had left. Subsequently, we've had opportunities to connect with. In fact, when we were serving as mission president and companion, one of the missionaries who was called to serve with us was the grandson of Nguyen Van Tay. And that was particularly tender to see this next generation after would be able to return and participate in building the kingdom.
You can read more about the church in Vietnam and about Nguyen Van Tay and his family in Saints Volume 4. We hope you gain new thoughts and insights from this episode. If you'd like to share, you can send them to us at saintspodcast@churchofjesuschrist.org. Thanks for listening.